Hello, I have two stories for you today, and the two stories are about cowboys. One is called Like a Cowboy, and the other is just called Cowboys. The first one that'll help us to learn some of the words that we need to know is Like a Cowboy. What was it like to be a cowboy long ago? To find out, some people stay on a ranch. They ride horses and they chase and rope cattle or cows. At night around a campfire, they tell stories and sing songs. They even take a herd of cattle on a cattle drive. Long ago, cowboys took herds of cattle on long cattle drives. They traveled on trails that ran from Texas to Kansas. From there, the railroad took the cattle to cities in the east. The trail was 1,000 miles long. The cattle drive lasted for months. The cattle drive at a ranch today lasts only a day or two. Still, the cattle drive gives people an idea of what it was like to be a cowboy. They can imagine how hard the cowboys worked on the trail. They can imagine how happy the cowboys were as they galloped into town after a long cattle drive. So here are some of the things we need to know about. So you can see cattle. Cattle is just another word for cow, so that's an easy one. Cowboy, or cowgirl also. These are the people that ride the horses, and now they ride quads. They don't just use horses, so that they can keep the cattle moving in the right direction. And there you see a herd. That means you have a bunch of them. So, our question today is, what can we learn about cowboy traditions? And our vocabulary. Cowboy we just talked about. Cattle is a cow. Campfire. It's not just a regular fire. It's a fire when you're out camping. And it has its own name. Campfire. Trails. Those are paths. Instead of taking a road, you take a path somewhere. Herd is when you have a set, a whole group of cows. We don't call them a group of cows. We call them a herd of cows. Galloped. When the horse is running fast. So if you want to gallop on a horse, you better hold on. And railroad. Those are trains. We say that you can travel by railroad. That's where you have train tracks and you ride in train cars. And that's what they're doing in the boxcar children. They're in a railroad car. All right. So here, let's hear our story about cowboys. Remember, what can we learn about cowboy traditions? If you were out west about 100 years ago, you might have heard a cowboy yelling, "Ki-yay, yip-yay," as he rode across the plains. What was it like to be a cowboy back then? Cowboys lived on cattle ranches. A ranch had a house for the rancher and his family, barns for the animals, and a bunk house where the cowboys slept. It's kind of like a house with all bunk beds in it. The rancher owned thousands of cattle. They wandered for miles, looking for grass and water. Twice a year, the cowboys drove all the cattle together. They brought them back into a big group. This was called a roundup. The cowboys counted the baby calves that had been born since the last roundup. The biggest cattle were chosen to sell at market. So here, this might have been what you would see as to where the house was. This is a ranch. So, that's the name of a cattle farm, basically. A roundup was hard work. The cattle were wild and fast. They had long, sharp, dangerous horns. Cowboys called them longhorns because they did have long horns. If you made a longhorn mad, it would charge at you. A cowboy didn't want to get too close to an angry longhorn, so he made a loop at the end of his rope. Then he twirled it over his head and let it fly. When he caught the longhorn, he could tell that it belonged to his ranch. How could he tell? It was easy. Each rancher put a special mark called a brand on his cows. Baby calves didn't have brands yet. They didn't need them. A baby calf always followed its mother. Every ranch had its own name and its own brand. The Rocking Chair Ranch brand looked like a rocking chair. The Flying V Ranch brand looked like this. So here he is. He's roping the cattle, the longhorn. And then you can see right there, that's the mark they would put on the cattle. After the roundup was over, it was time to sell the longhorns. That meant taking them to big market towns. Back then, there were no roads across the wide plains, only dusty trails. The cattle had made them with their hooves as they tramped along. Some trails were 1,000 miles long. Since cattle could walk only 15 miles a day, the long, hard trip often lasted months, because it takes a lot of 15s to make 1,000. It was called a trail drive. There was a lot to do to get ready. At the beginning of the trail day, one cowboy rode out in front of the herd. "Come on, boys," he'd call to the cattle. A few big longhorns started after him. They bellowed and swung their heads from side to side. Other cattle followed, and soon they were all on their way. Cattle didn't like so much walking. After a while, they wanted to turn around and go home. Cowboys rode up and down the sides of the herd to keep them in line. A few cowboys rode at the end of the herd to make sure no cattle were left behind. So here they are in big groups, big herds, and all the people on horses helping keep the cows moving. It was hot on the trail. Cowboys wore hats with wide brims to keep the sun out of their eyes. When it rained, the brims made good umbrellas. Around their necks, they wore red bandanas. When it got dusty, they'd pull the bandanas over their noses like a mask. You might have seen people with bandanas on. Leather leggings, called chaps, were tied over their pants to keep out thorns and cactus spines. High leather boots kept out dirt and pebbles. Cowboy boots had handles called mule ears. The cowboy grabbed the mule ears to pull his boots on. So if you see this guy pulling his boots on, he's grabbing the mule ears with his finger there so he can get his foot in all the way. What else did a cowboy need on the trail? A good horse. Cowboys spent the whole day on horseback. They rode little horses called cow ponies. A good cow pony was fearless. It would cross rough ground in the blackest of nights, and it would swim a deep, wide river. It would crash right through the bushes after a runaway cow. The cowboy had to hold on tight. Every day, the herd tramped the hot, dark, dry plains. 2 or 3 big steers were the leaders. They always walked in front. The cowboys got to know them well. They gave them pet names like Old Grumpy and Starface. Cows could get into trouble. Sometimes one got stuck in the mud. The cowboy roped it and pulled it out. A cow might get hurt on the trail, and a cowboy took care of that too. So they're still walking in this big group, but this one cow went off to the side and he got stuck in the mud, so the cowboy's helping him get out. At night, the cowboys stopped to let the cattle eat, drink, and sleep. It was time for the cowboys to eat too. Cookie had a hot meal ready for them. That's what the cowboys called the cook. Cookie drove a special wagon, and it was called the chuck wagon. It had drawers for flour, salt, beans, and pots and pans. A water barrel was tied underneath. Cookie gave every cowboy a big helping of biscuits, steak, gravy, and beans. He cooked the same meal almost every night, but the cowboys didn't mind. It tasted so good. There were no tables or chairs, so the cowboys sat right on the ground, and after dinner they played cards or read by the flickering light of the campfire. The nights were chilly and bright with stars. Here they are having their dinner, and there's the chuck wagon. So it's a covered wagon, but it's basically a traveling restaurant. That's how they got their food, because there was no place to go to the store. But the cowboys didn't stay up late. They were tired. At bedtime, they pulled off their boots and crawled into their bedrolls. A cowboy never wore pajamas. What about a pillow? He used his saddle. Trail drives were dangerous. Many things could go wrong. The herd might stampede if there was a loud noise, like a sudden crash of thunder. A stampede was scary. That's when all of them run at the same time. Cattle ran wildly in all directions, rolling their eyes and bellowing with fear. The ground shook underneath them. The bravest cowboys galloped to the front of the herd. They had to make the leaders turn. They shouted at them and fired their 6-shooters in the air. A 6-shooter is a type of a gun they used back then. They tried to make the cattle run in a circle until they calmed down. Sometimes they would run into rustlers. A rustler was a cow thief. Rustlers hid behind rocks and jumped out at the cattle to make them stampede. And while the cowboys were trying to catch the terrified cattle and calm them down, the rustlers got in and drove off as many as they could. So they got them all running in different directions, and then the robbers, the rustlers, would steal as many as they could. When the herd came to a big river, the cowboys in front galloped right into the water. The cattle plunged in right after them. The cattle swam mostly underwater. Sometimes the cowboys could see only the tip of their black noses and their long white horns. Most cowboys didn't know how to swim. If a cowboy fell in the water, he grabbed the horse's tail and held on tight till they got to shore. Trail drives often went through Native American territory. The Native Americans charged 10 cents a head to let the cattle cross their land. If the cowboys didn't pay, there might be a fight. But usually the money was handed over and the herd plodded on. So here they are crossing a big river. The horses swim, the cowboys ride on the back of the horses. See him right there? There's a cowboy holding on to a horse because he wasn't able to stay on it. And the cows are crossing too. At last, the noisy, dusty cattle stomped into a market town. The cowboys drove them into pens, kind of fenced areas near the railroad tracks. Then they got their pay. It was time for fun. What do you think most cowboys wanted first? A bath. The barber had a big tub in the back of his shop. For $1, you could soak and soak and soak. A boy kept throwing in pails of hot water. Oh, felt so good. Next, it was time for a shave, a haircut, and some new clothes. Tonight, the cowboys would sleep in real beds and eat dinner at a real table. They would sing, dance, and have fun with their friends. But soon, they would be heading back to Longhorn Country. There would be many more hot days in the saddle, and there would be many more cold nights under the stars. So being a cowboy was hard work. You didn't get to sleep in a bed for 3, 4, 5 months maybe. And your food followed you in a wagon. It was probably pretty interesting. I hope you enjoyed the story. Bye.